Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the Mind Games podcast. I'm going to stop saying full format now because it pretty much is just the full format all the time at this point, where each episode we piece together the puzzle that is mental health with a bit of stuff in between. So this is real talk from two very real people. I am Thomas Walburn, chronic health warrior, multimedia extraordinaire. Joining me on this inner path of discovery is my co-presenter and the master of positivity, the macaroni to my cheese, Chris Allen, occupational health advisor, mental health first aid instructor, and all-round great guy. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm doing great. Thank you. Yeah.
What did you think of that
That
one?
was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Well,
Thank
you can't have, mac and cheese. You can't just have macaroni on its own, and you can't just have cheese on its own.
Oh, I am, because
Well, I suppose you can,
I'm on keto,
actually.
so I'm having the cheese and not the mac. It's a tragic state of affairs, but thank you. That was a brilliant intro. That really made me laugh. I really like that one. I think this to and fro at the start is going to be one of the things that, you're constantly just trying to make me crease.
Well, I am. Like I say, I've got a list. I've got a list of things on my phone that I've made, and they're going to get increasingly worse.
Great.
So
keep it going. Keep it going. I can't wait for the next one now.
So obviously, we've got 3 sections of the podcast. We say this every time. We have the discussion, the Q&A, and the in-clinic. So I'm just going to go over the topics at the start for this one quickly. Just to summarize, actually, because I think it's probably useful. So for the discussion, we're going to be talking about Disability Awareness Month. For Q&A, we're going to be taking a question from someone. Obviously, I'm not going to name them yet because it's kind of a bit of a surprise, but it's to do with trauma. And then in the in-clinic, we've got a question that someone sent in, which actually requires a bit more deeper discussion. So we've decided that we're going to use this for the in-clinic because it's quite an interesting topic. And I don't really want to say more about that because I think that's going to be something quite interesting. So we'll get into that. But in the beginning, just the intro. Obviously, we've got England, Chris. We're recording this the day after.
It is. It's the heartbreak is still very raw. And it was this morning for the kids as well. There was a lot of tears last night going to bed. A lot of tears.
Yeah.
Yeah, so England unfortunately lost to Italy on penalties, which it was a remarkable achievement given that I don't really follow any sort of football, but I didn't really give them much of a chance. And of course, all the way through, we were putting caveats on the end of our expectations for the game. They're probably going home. There's no way they're going to get past this team. No way, especially after the performance against Scotland. And then no way we're going to get past Denmark. And England just kept doing better and better, didn't they? But
until Italy.
Until Italy.
The Italy performance was, I mean, like I say, my knowledge of football basically goes up until the late 90s, and then it just kind of falls off a cliff because I think, probably early to mid 2000s is where I started to drift off. Once Man City got bought and their stadium became the Etihad, that was kind of my drift away from football. But all I would really say is that, that it was Italy's game. We scored early, but from then on, it was pretty much just all Italy. I think in extra time, we came back a little bit, but it was still Italy just looked, they had the experience. You could just tell they were running rings around us with the passing, and we're still a young team. So I don't take it away from them. I think tactically as well, there was a few things that I would just say quickly. I thought it was odd in extra time that all of the substitutions, I mean, Southgate took a gamble because he kept a lot of the substitutions for penalties. That seemed to be his tactic. He had a lot of subs to use, and he basically brought, it was Rashford and Sancho on right at the end. He was planning to go for penalties. He obviously had this all worked out. It was a tactic that he went with. and it didn't pay off. So, and I think part of that was just because you put in a 19-year-old kid in his first Euro final, getting him to take a penalty that could potentially win England's first major tournament since 1966. Obviously, he's going to be bricking it.
Oh, I mean, come on. The pressure on that kid. I remember I was shouting at the screen, like, no, it can't be him. Now, we'd be having a very different conversation right now if that penalty had gone in. But I assure you, I was going, no, it can't be him. He's too young. He's too young. And those years are so formative as well, aren't they? And this is something he'll carry with him. And I may be wrong. This may well be the making of Saka as a man and a player.
Yeah.
You know, look at Southgate's rebound from, the pit of despair to now. He's been held in very high esteem, but he was vilified by the press. And with that in mind, I just hope that the press don't do the same thing to these three boys. It's unfortunate that, it's fortunate for Southgate that there was no social media back then. It is unfortunate for these three boys, Marcus Rashford, who I believe deserves a standing ovation every time he sets foot on a pitch for what he's done for our children and their school dinners.
And he's only 23.
Goodness me, the things I was getting up to when I was 23 was definitely not feeding children like on a national scale because the government not prioritizing it. That kid, Saka, I didn't know who he was until this tournament, and I'm so glad I know who he is because he's so talented. And Sancho as well. I don't know really who those two chaps were.
And he's only 21, so it's 23, 21, 19. So that's why. They're just inexperienced, and it was I think the pressure got to them of a major tournament, and that should be a closed book conversation.
I think so as well.
They still did well.
They deserve better. They did well. They deserve better from the public. I've seen with my own eyes a lot of discourse about not singling them out. And I have seen some of the discourse that has been singling them out and blaming them. And some of that stuff is just sickening. Today, it feels, for many people, and last night especially, it felt like the most important thing in the world, but it will pass. This too shall pass. And for those boys, I hope time brings perspective and they can find positives out of this adversity that they're going through and move forward in a positive way, in a more resilient way. I don't know how they're coping. I don't know what's going on, but one would hope that, if they are suffering as a result of this, then, time will heal and provide the perspective necessary for them to move on. I really hope they don't get scapegoated. I hope the press is very sensible. And this is, the most important story at the moment for these three men. And it will hopefully diminish that sense of blame or guilt or responsibility. Or those boys did their country proud, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, the thing you said about Southgate's spot on as well, because like you say, when he took over England, he was vilified in the media. Everyone was saying he was going to be useless and he had no experience. And, he managed the under-21 squad and blah, blah, blah. He's never managed a major international club before. He hasn't won any silverware. Why is he going to be in charge of England? So give people a chance, really. And another thing as well is we don't want this to turn into racism. And I think it already is. You're seeing on the internet that there are certain things happening as a result of it that could be considered racist. They never miss the penalties because they are black.
Thank you. I think that's such a great and important point.
Yeah, it just so happened that three people missed penalties who were black. It doesn't mean that they missed it because they are black.
Yeah, three men missed penalties. Three men and young men missed penalties. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So
it's only in the discourse that came around it that I even noticed that was an element. It's so sad.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, with that sad tone in mind, but still massive props to a very young England team who are still maturing in their journey. And we hope that when the World Cup comes around in 2 years is it now? I think it's a shorter one.
The World Cup is in Qatar next year, isn't it? 2022?
Yeah, it's not long at all.
Yeah.
I think it's in Christmas. It's Christmas.
Oh, wow, that's going to be great. More tournament football, more knockout football. Yeah.
We'll see how they do in that one. You know, I'm sure they've learnt a lot, and we should still be very proud as a country. I think it's our first major final in since 1966. So I think that much is great. So let's go into the discussion on that note.
Discussion.
Okay, everyone. So welcome to the discussion part of the podcast. And we've got one major topic, I guess, this week, which is a lesser known kind of event on the mental health kind of awareness calendar that comes up every year. And this one is Disability Pride Month. So I actually got the name wrong in the introduction because I was researching it myself. Because, fun fact, it's actually not a very well-known kind of event in the calendar. And I think it's more because it's from across the pond. It's more of an American thing, but I think it's picking up traction in the UK. And, you know, what they stand for is just the usual good stuff about promoting, you know, good conversations about disability, less disability prejudice. It goes back to like workplace stuff like me and Chris have talked about. I think it started off mainly about more specific disabilities, such as people who are blind and things like that. And it's kind of expanded now into this whole kind of ethos of just disabilities in general. And it goes to the emotional side as well. So it's not just about prejudice, but it's about how people deal with disability themselves and the emotional turmoil that it can put on people who maybe suffer from these. And it is getting, it's getting a lot more airtime, I think, this year compared to any other years prior. So I thought it was a good one for us to talk about, Chris, because I know from a mental health point as well, and we've talked about it, disability can be a big burden on people's mental health.
Yeah, I agree. It can be. And this is the reason why this event is on my radar as well. And I am met often with people with hidden disabilities and the discrimination that they experience as well. One of the main ones is when someone has got a sort of pre-existing back injury, which is not overtly visible, but they require a receipt on the tube train or something like this, and they don't want to ask because they don't appear unwell. And I just always encourage them to ask for a seat, just ask for a seat. That's been going on for years, but now, the tube system, the Transport for London have brought out these cards or these badges that say, please offer me a seat and things like that. So, I mean, that's some of the ways that it's being managed, but hidden disabilities do have their own set of challenges, and life can be challenging with their hidden disabilities. So when we think about the types of hidden disabilities that people might live with, I mean, it runs the gamut of a number of health conditions, including mental ill health. Anxiety cannot really be seen so well unless it's being expressed through body language. Things like depression as well, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. But when I was looking at this, I was really interested to find that, a condition that I live with myself, which is quite severe chronic asthma, is, I remember having these conversations with my workplace way back when I first got a shielding letter. I was really surprised, but it can be considered a disability amongst many others. So, I mean, what we need to do, and a point of view that I really want to come across with, is that the stats that I've got here, and I know you've got some stats as well, but I think the one that really fully impacted me the most really was that 1 in 5 people have a disability in the UK, and 80% of those, 80% of those, are hidden disabilities. So I
Wow.
thought that was like a really important sort of central point to put out.
So is that
It's easy.
Was that young? When you say was that young adults? You said
No, I just said people. One
just
in four people.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know what the statistic is for young adults as well, because I imagine for young adults, I mean, I don't have that stat in front of me, but for young adults especially, I imagine invisible disabilities are much more prevalent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're seeing the rates of things like autism increasing in the population, especially in the young. We're seeing a lot of these sort of things coming through as well, which can be considered as disabilities. When we're thinking about disability, of course, it's always to do with the impact on one's functional capacity.
Mm.
So, I mean, what we're not doing here is sitting here and being the arbitrator or the judge of what is and what isn't a disability. So if I've missed out, and I know I have missed out a voluminous amount of disabilities when I've just been talking about it there, that doesn't mean to diminish anyone's experience. I mean, even as a clinician, I cannot determine who is or isn't disabled. And I think this is quite an interesting conversation to have, Tom. Do you know who in the UK can judge whether someone's got a disability or not?
I don't. I don't.
Can you guess? Can you just throw something out there? I mean, most people would say a doctor, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, I guess I would say it's up to the doctors and the healthcare system to decide if you're disabled. But
yeah, it's up to the doctors and the healthcare system to provide support, and potentially it's up to someone like me to advise a workplace on workplace adjustments. But I cannot say, and there aren't any instances I know of where a clinician has said this person is disabled. It actually takes a judge in a court of law to decide whether someone's disabled or not, which is why a lot of the conversation around it is to do with reasonable adjustments, functional capacity. But I just thought that was an interesting aside there. I know.
No, I must say I was kind of thinking that through in my head myself, and I was thinking the same thing, because through my experiences, I've never had somebody say to me, "You're disabled," and I don't imagine that conversation really comes up unless it's an obvious disability. Again, that's not a term that I particularly like, but when we're talking about invisible illnesses versus visible illnesses, there are certain disabilities that you can see, which I guess are more obvious to a clinician. So they're more likely to label that as a disability. But even then, like you say, it's a label. It's not legally binding or anything like that. So I guess to get the proper support, you need to go through the courts.
May well. I mean, my experience of disability comes through discrimination and the Equality Act, previously the Disability Discrimination Act. And yeah, so a lot of the language I use around it originates from there, because I have to be precise for my work. But in, general terms, you're right. One place that I would recommend that people go to access more resources, if you want to know a little more about this topic, there was a really good podcast that I listened to yesterday that educated me a little bit, and it was coming out of the Visible Disability Project. That's the Disability Visibility Project. Sorry, I got it wrong. The Disability Visibility Project. They've got a really good podcast where they engage with people. They talk to people who live with visible and invisible disabilities. But it was particularly enlightening for me to hear some lived experience from people who have these sort of conditions that can sometimes lead other people to either behave discriminatory without knowing, or be overtly sort of aggressive about it. Why do you need a seat? Why do you need to park in a blue space? Like, where's your disability? Because I think common misconceptions is that, it's easy to see and judge who needs what in our society. So yeah, when we're thinking about discrimination, these are the kind of places that I would tend to drift to in order to educate myself about it.
Well, that goes hand in hand with some of the stuff that I was looking at on it, which is it's by a charity called Scope in the UK. They're a big disability charity. And they did in 2018. They did the Disability Perception Gap Report, which is it's a PDF that you can get from their site, and it has loads of good, interesting feedback from disabled and non-disabled people. Again, that term to me is odd because, like you say, disability is such a big spectrum that even someone with asthma could technically be classed as disabled. So defining disabled versus someone who is fully abled, I think is incredibly difficult because most of us have something. But one interesting stat that I saw was 1 in 3 disabled people feel there is a lot of disability prejudice in Britain today still. But then when you talk to people who consider themselves non-disabled, only 1 in 5 actually think that. So that tells me that there's a discrepancy between the able-bodied people thinking that people with disabilities are getting the support they need, whereas the disabled people don't necessarily agree. And someone who's gone through that system, I would say that I can totally understand how people can think that. I was more lucky in that I did get quite a lot of support, but it gets to a certain point, especially if it's a chronic disability with no real outcome, that you do feel like your support is drying up because there's not really any further that they can go. And then obviously you've got the other support that you need if you've got a comorbid disability that makes you less able to move around and things like that. Like, then you've got the whole thing of, well, who's going to support me financially and who's going to make sure that my, where I live is properly equipped for me to deal with this disability. So I think there's lots of things that generally people who are not disabled don't think of that people who are disabled need support with. So I thought that was an interesting stat. And I mean, I don't think I have anything against the people who were in that study who were non-disabled and maybe thought that we're getting enough support, because I think it's a tricky one unless you're actually in that situation, living it. You don't really understand how much people go through who are disabled and all of the adjustments that they need to make their life more reasonable. So I think it's perfectly understandable that people wouldn't know that. And then another one that I had, which I just thought was quite interesting, was that 33%, 1 in 3 people see disabled people as being less productive than non-disabled people. And I guess you could say that's prejudice because we're not, again, invisible illness, we're not all people who are not productive. So it's just, if you go to Chris's world and where he works, occupational health, it's about giving people the adjustments so that they can be productive, right? So that you don't have to get rid of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes those adjustments can be temporary, just for the time being, while recovery takes place. Recovery from an episode of disability takes place. Are you with me?
Yeah. Again, because like you say, mental disabilities don't have to be physical. They can be mental as well. So like, if somebody's going through a phase where they need more support, that is what you would offer to get them through it. Yeah. So I think all in all, that's basically my bit. I just thought there were some interesting stats, and I don't think that there's ever going to be. Again, people look at this stuff with rose-tinted glasses a bit, don't they? And some people want everything to be perfect for disabled people, and a lot of disabled people want it as well. But I think you have to understand the system and the way things work, and you have to be, again, realistic, retrospectoscope, as you like to call it. You've got to look at everything, including the people who are not disabled, because I don't think it's fair to pass judgment on them all the time, because they're not going to understand it like someone who is disabled.
Yeah.
And there is an education part, isn't there?
There is. And it's just another layer of complexity that the individual has to work through. It's a shame, but most of the people who have been either invisibly disabled or visibly disabled, if, within the context of what we're talking about here, that I've encountered, recognize that it's not perfect, and that educating people and helping people to understand and relieve as a process of relieving stigma and discrimination. I think, workplaces are doing better when it comes to revealing and uncovering and educating people about things like unconscious bias. And it's relevant beyond, the element of race in which a lot of that gets pitched. It's relevant for people who are differently abled as well.
And I think you have to look at homeworking, the potential for homeworking in the future as a potential benefit for people who are physically disabled, as an opportunity to help them, I guess, get back into work if that disability has stopped them. I think there's a lot of potential for these kinds of new avenues that we're going to see post-pandemic to help more of those people enjoy life at work better.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah. So I think that was a pretty quick conversation, but I think we've wrapped it up. I mean, I
agree.
Anything else to say, and I think it was a good section.
I agree.
So with that, we're going to move on to the Q&A section now. And as we said earlier, we've got a question, quite an interesting one this week. So we'll see you over there in a second.
Q&A.
Hello, everyone. We're back with the Q&A section, and we've got a very interesting question this week, and it was sent into the inbox at askmindgamesuk@gmail.com if you want to send in any more, and we're going to get Chris to read this one out.
Sure. Thanks very much, Tom. So the question I've got that has come through to me is, how do you stop yourself or your mind from overtaking you and making you act out of control? These thoughts, behaviors, and feelings that arise from deep trauma that you can't control, how do you stop those? So that comes from a listener that we'll call HC. So what I think would be a useful thing to talk about, first of all, is sources of trauma. So trauma has got a wide range of ways of it being defined. And if you think about the things that cause trauma, you could think about violence. That could be witnessed violence or experienced violence. That could be when you're a child, you could witness violence. Maybe there's an element of elder abuse. Then you've got the physical side of trauma where you've been hurt, or the sexual side of trauma where it comes with other weights as well. Mugging, robbery, these are all sources of trauma. And then you've got the accident side of things where you may have been in a traumatic accident or witnessed a traumatic accident, witnessing something terrible. We do need to talk a little bit, because we both live in London. We need to acknowledge the fact that, terrorist attacks happen, and the Manchester Arena attack, and there's a lot of trauma that comes out of spinning out of that. And then, of course, you've got the family side of things where you've got things like infidelity, violence within the home, things like this that we need to be mindful of as well. So that's what we can sort of use, I think, as a jumping off point in order to have this conversation. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good start. I think because we live in a big city, like you said, London, I think it can be quite easy, I guess, if we're talking about your mind overtaking you as well and kind of acting out of control. There's a hustle and bustle element to living in a big city that can sometimes be overwhelming for the average person. So I don't know if I'd just inject that into the conversation, but I think definitely sometimes you need to recharge and get away, and that can be good to help clear your mind if you're struggling.
Yeah, good point. And so the way we need to think about it, I think, when it comes to overcoming trauma is through the context of like emotional damage that's been done to you. The emotional damage that has happened is causing behaviors to arise which feel out of control. Yeah, that's what I will infer from this question. And so the person who's asking might struggle with controlling some of these behaviors in a way that these behaviors that arise from trauma have become ingrained. And I like to think of it as water flows down the path of least resistance. So the more that these reactions, these behaviors that feel out of control occur, the more they become ingrained within our psyche, within our set of behavioral clusters, if you like. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So while I'm not necessarily interested, I don't think here, in going down the route of what is an acute stress reaction and what is a post-traumatic disorder reaction and the differences and the similarities between the two, I think we can talk, broadly about some symptoms, because I think the symptom side of things is better to talk about the classic symptoms that people might experience when it comes to trauma reactions or anxious disorder in relation to trauma reactions, because there's so many different labels of conditions. But when you reveal, there is a lot of very common symptoms throughout all of them. Are you with me?
Yeah, again. It's quite complicated, but
it can be. But in reaction to a trauma that, someone has experienced, which could be the trauma of losing a parent or a loved one, any sort of that sort of trauma, we can kind of put it in context for ourselves, and we can recognize that maybe in those contexts we've experienced some unstable emotions.
Well,
sorry?
I was going to say I can probably relate to that myself. So yeah, if you're going to talk about that element, I've definitely experienced that.
What else?
About trauma and
in reaction to that sort of trauma, I'm thinking of, what I want to do is not put a ring around, what one PTSD is and what one acute stress reaction is, but just reveal what the symptoms are. So I'm thinking along the lines of these sort of unstable emotions, angry outbursts, intrusive negative thoughts, a sense of numbness or expressions of hopelessness, these sort of things. Are you with me?
Yeah, I think trauma, like you say, trauma can be expressed in so many different ways because it's unique to the individual. And we all take trauma in our own way, don't we? So I would be honest. I'm honest with myself now. I wasn't at the time, but when my dad passed away from a long battle with a pretty brutal cancer, my own way of dealing with it, I suppose that's my trauma, was I pretty much just acted like it hadn't even happened. It was more like it didn't register in my brain. And it's taken years for it to re-register and for me to kind of talk about it in a way, I guess, that has emotion attached, if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah, it does. It sounds like you tried to compartmentalize it, lock it in a box and bury it deep down, but it kept calling. So you've worked out a way to interact with that emotion.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say that. And it doesn't, I don't get upset about it. But when I talk about it, it's not just, I don't feel numb talking about it, is what I would say. Because at the time when it happened, your body, when something like that happens, goes through such a bizarre change that I can't really describe, because again, it depends on the individual, I guess. Some people will grieve and cry, and others will just act strangely normal on the outside, but inside they're probably not, and they might not even realize it until several years later. So I think that would be my addition of what I experienced with my own trauma. During the whole thing as well, I probably did the same thing. During the actual event that caused my trauma, I was, again, like you say, compartmentalizing it and acting like it wasn't there. I would almost talk to my dad like it was normal. and I didn't really want to acknowledge what was happening in front of me. And I didn't right up until he passed away. I still didn't acknowledge it, and it's something that I regret, and I do carry on my shoulders. And I guess that could be called trauma as well, because there's some regret there that I wish I'd have been more open about it and talked about his condition with him a bit more, I guess, realistically, rather than just acting like it wasn't there and he was healthy and just saying to him really, really silly things like, I'll see you in November and all of this stuff, when there was probably no chance, really. But we all deal with it in our own way, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And you did the best that you could in that context. And I think the takeaway message that we can learn from your experience is that you found a way to work with the pain rather than continue to deny that the pain was there. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
And so if we are collectively together, if Mind Games, not just Chris, if Mind Games are going to give advice to someone, we're going to give advice to HC about how to overcome the behaviors that are resulting from this trauma, then what I would like to start with is really by bringing two things onto the table here. The first one would be with a professional, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the second one would be journaling. And I'll explain why for both contexts. Mm-hmm. Would you have anything else within your own sphere of experience, your own arsenal of self-care tips, or maybe some professional help that you received that you think should also be on the table at this stage? When it comes to answering HC's question about recovery from trauma, overcoming trauma, and the behavioral elements and regaining control.
So I think one thing I would say to HC is that, has that person actually tried to receive any form of professional help? I didn't. And I think now I dealt with it in my own way. However, I do think if I'd have got professional help, I do think it would have been beneficial at the time. It would have given me an avenue to talk to someone who was outside of that bubble of what was going on and what had happened. Because the issue with, I guess, any situation like that, and I'm sure this person probably feels the same, is that I think you can't really, if this is a trauma that involves a lot of people and they're probably all close, like family, friends, I would imagine it's probably something which has a network of people that are involved in this and or talk about it, right? And you sometimes need that person outside of that bubble to go to with just a completely impartial, just even a clinical, if you will, just view of the whole thing that you can just talk frankly to, because you can't really do that with family and friends sometimes. From my situation, I couldn't really talk to my family about it because they were grieving as well. So the responses that they would give me were not necessarily rational either. So if you need support, then don't always reach out to your family and friends. But I think you've also got to think to yourself that it can sometimes be good to get an outside perspective as well, or just somebody to even vent to and just get those feelings out to someone who's not involved.
Yeah. Now, what I would like to say on that, to build on that, is to bring the cognitive behavioral therapy part into the equation. But I will preface it with this. What has happened to you, HC, was not your doing. It was not you didn't cause this, but it now is your problem. Okay, so we need to take ownership of that. You didn't cause this thing to happen, but it is your problem because you're asking us for advice and help about overcoming the behavioral side of this. So this is causing you problems in your life. So you must address those. And as with what Tom is saying, I completely agree that the more you talk to your friends and family and get support, the better. However, what you will often get back from friends and family is a very biased, very weighted in your favor response. Why did this happen to you? Yeah, why did this happen to me? Why does this keep happening to you? Or why do you keep feeling this way? And it's terrible. Yes, I do. And it reaffirms your feelings, which will reaffirm your behaviors.
Yeah.
What I would suggest, and the reason I bring in journaling as well will follow shortly, but critically examine the thought processes. And this is where CBT is powerful. And the first person you go to talk to about CBT might not be the right one, but please persevere. Find a second person, because not everyone is for everybody. Okay, so if you don't get on with the first one that you talk to, the first counselor, the first therapist, try again, and then at least you've done your best. But the way CBT can help you, HC, I think, is examining some of these unconscious thought patterns that you've fallen into, which are affecting your behavior. So CBT works on the following principle: A, B, C. Activating event, belief, consequence. The activating event was something traumatic happened. The beliefs you have about that is where the magic can happen and is what is leading to the consequences, which is your behavior. If you can find a way to interact with the second element of that equation, A, B, C, activating event, beliefs, consequences. The B part, if you can interact with how you feel about the fact that you are traumatized, then you hopefully will be on a way to resolving this particular issue that you describe. Therein also is where you can find support in journaling. Journaling in a structured way, and I'll give you 2 companies that provide these journals, but I don't want you to buy them. I want you to critically examine the books themselves online. Just look at Amazon, look at the pages, look at Google Images and understand how they're structured. And I want you to do it for yourself. I don't want you to invest in buying it from a company, because I think it will be much more powerful if you can deploy it yourself. What happens if that company that you buy the book from goes out of business, or they're sold out and you can't buy a new one? You're lost then. I'm fully behind you developing your own structure when it comes to journaling and critically examining your thought processes, your behaviors, and the actions that arise from that. Tom, as the non-professional point of view, I suppose, the non-clinical point of view, the experiential point of view within this context, is anything that I've said here, do you think requires clarity, requires further addition? Or do you think everything I said is clear enough, and hopefully HC will get the benefit of our discussion?
I think you're saying it from a clinical point of view, so I think it's all good to me. And I would say that I'm not the biggest proponent of CBT for some things. I've made that clear. Mainly pain, but I think if we're gonna talk about the flip side of dealing with, depression and anxiety and all of that sort of stuff, trauma as well, I can see how it would be useful, because it part of CBT as well is educating you of your own illness and allowing you in a way to become your own therapist in some way, so that you understand it. And I think getting an understanding of what has caused it and allowing you to move past it is one of the most important things, because you can just get stuck in a rut of thinking about your own trauma and just never actually getting over it. So I think you do need something to kind of create that pivot for you to move past it. And if CBT is the way forward, then I would recommend it as well. And I've never tried it for anything like that, so I'm not vouching personally, but I could see it as a viable treatment for something like that.
Again, well, I should say, not formal medical advice, just my opinion.
Yeah. What more to be said? I mean, it sounds like it's not this person's, obviously it's not, this person never caused their own trauma. It wasn't in any way created by them. It was obviously something else that caused it outside. So there's probably an element of, I guess, self-doubt in there, maybe. And that might be why they feel the way they do. Because I know with some types of trauma, especially if it's not caused by yourself, you can still feel like you indirectly caused it and that maybe you were the problem, and you can beat yourself up about it when actually in reality it's nothing to do with you.
Mm. You're talking a little bit, I think, about survivor's guilt, or if there's sometimes when there's been spousal abuse, well, I made him angry, or if there's been infidelity, what did I do that led to this? All those self-doubt and self-esteem issues can also hopefully be productively engaged in or with by a professional.
Mm.
That's what I think.
And it's a cycle that you need to break.
Mm. Yeah, like I said, it's the path of least resistance. It will continue to reinforce itself the more you allow it to take place. And this is where the responsibility comes in for being critically judgmental about our thought processes and how that affects and conjures up behaviors that feel beyond our control.
Mm. And I guess I'd just say one more thing before we move on, because you mentioned the point of how getting advice from friends and family is great, but it can be biased. And I think that's a really good thing to put out, because your friends and family mean well to you. They're not giving you the advice because they don't care about you. But again, you have to think about the bigger picture, and obviously because they care about you and because they want the best from you, they're going to have a certain slanted opinion because they like you. So that's why going out of that bubble and getting impartial professional advice can sometimes help you to get out of the cycle. And funnily enough, I think that goes back to the occupational health chat that I had with Chris, because I never knew this guy before I had the chat with him. And yeah, I was getting lots of advice from my friends and family about how I should just leave my job. I know it's not related to the trauma that you're going through, but I think it's a similar use case in that I was stuck in a rut in terms of, just jumping from one job to the next that I hated. And people were telling me, well, why don't you just leave? It'd be so easy to leave and things like that. But because it was in my bubble, I think there was a certain bias there. So I needed that outside intervention to kind of push me and have a frank conversation, because in a way they were pandering to me as well by saying certain things, and that wasn't necessarily their fault. It was just because they liked me and they didn't want to hurt my feelings, etc. Whereas I think the discussion I had with Chris was more frank, and I guess sometimes you need that.
And if I may interject, and if I may say so, I think the people who were around you was asking you, why don't you leave, were conjuring up reasons in your mind for you to stay. Why don't you leave? Oh, well, I need the money. Why don't you leave? Oh, well, I won't be able to get another job if I leave.
That's true.
I think the point of view I was coming from was, how would it look if you left? So instead of why questions, I'm asking how and what questions. So what would it be like if you left? How would it look like? What would be required for you in order to feel more comfortable with leaving? So very subtle but quite significant difference on the impact it has on your mind. One question, the first one, why don't you leave, is provoking you into a scarcity point of view. How and what question is asking you to draw up more resources which can be used, internal resources which can be used to align yourself with a plan to actually get out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's the key difference between someone who knows how to affect behavior change and some, people that love you, they just want to be supportive. So that's another reason why it's a good idea to talk to a professional who, can help you elicit some of these behavior changes, HC.
Yeah, because there was no fear boundary, basically. The fear boundary was gone. Instead of dwelling on those bits. You were putting it across in a very specific and trained manner, because obviously that's what you do, to elicit a certain response which is beneficial to the patient.
Yeah. They don't teach this at school, though. They don't teach this at occupational health school. I had to go and figure that out. But yeah, as I've said before, once your advice stops landing on people and you're seeing them for the third or fourth time for the same problem, start to need to look inside. Why is my advice not landing properly? It's me that's the issue here. So that was the journey of discovery that I went on. But thank you for your question, HC. And if anyone else has got questions and they want to get our point of view about it, do drop us a line at the email address, which will be now, I believe, floating on the screen.
Yeah, askmindgamesuk@gmail.com.
Via the magic of technology. Thank you, HC.
No, that was a really good question. And I mean, I'm sure Chris helped, but I hope me injecting my personal experience with it helped as well. And, we wish you all the best. And on that note, I guess we're going to shoot into the in-clinic section now, because that was our one question, but it was a big one. So I think it warranted a big response. And we're now going to go into the in-clinic because we've got a more personal, I wouldn't say it's personal, but it's one that requires more of a deeper thinking process behind it, I guess. So we're going to go over there and we'll see you in a second.
In clinic.
Okay, so we're back with the in clinic. And Chris has got the question up in front of him. He's gonna read it out now. It is from someone that we will call S.
Yeah. Let's call them SG for this question so they can identify themselves. But the question goes as follows. What are some of the best ways that you can encourage a loved one to seek mental health help? What are some of the best ways you can encourage a loved one to seek mental health help? And there's some background for added flavor, which I think it's worthy of teasing out some of the details from this. And rather than reading out precisely what's been said, I think what I'll do is just sort of highlight some of the elements that are in play here. So it's they're asking on behalf of a partner who is probably suffering some kind of anxiety issue or maybe depression. It seems to be resulting from the pandemic and some work-related elements as well. There's some stuff around self-image, and there's some alcohol involved, maybe drinking, maybe self-medication, and other unhealthy habits, but not illegal drug use. And deploying these as self-medication habits to mask, perhaps. So that's the question. And the reason I highlight some of those additional elements is because it's going to color the way we orientate the conversation. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So I think what I would start with is talking a little bit around and about how you can have conversations with loved ones about mental health. And I'm going to try and be really careful not to go into the granular details. I want to try and keep it surface level to a degree, because I cannot possibly coach you to have the similar conversations that I have. What I can do, though, is coach you to have supportive conversations orientated towards getting the right professional help or doing some of the right self-help behaviors. Okay?
Yeah.
Good. So when I think about someone who is a partner, someone that you love, what you owe your partner is emotional support, respect, and the love that's in the equation as well. So these are the things that we owe the people that we love. And in order for us to make a connection that's constructive and move through that element, first of all, I think we need to start asking questions about how they're doing, what their feelings are, what is driving some of these behaviors. And when we receive the answers, what I would like to do is suggest that we listen in a non-judgmental way. Because, SG, I think as soon as we start hooking onto what we believe to be the destructive behaviors that we're observing, which is alcohol use or unhealthy habits, as soon as we start hooking onto those, there will be an element of shutdown. So I suggest perhaps that right now, a conversation around the emotions that are being sensed rather than the behaviors that you're very legitimately concerned about might help. I would like to suggest that before you engage in this conversation as well, you could perhaps go on a little bit of information gathering. Find out what sort of professional help is available for the problems that you perceive to be the issue. Of course, what comes out in the wash, if you like, might not necessarily be the thing. It might not be alcohol that is the root cause of the problem. Maybe there's something else that is driving the use of alcohol. But what's available? What can you find in your local area? So how do you make an appointment with your GP? That's one of the most fundamental ones. Is it done by phone call? Is it done by filling out an online form? Do you have to call at a certain time in the day? Gather that information. Beyond that, what sort of help and support is there with regard to some of these behaviors? If it feels right, if there is acknowledgement that alcohol is a problem, and there is a conversation to be had there, what support is there? Are there any support groups? If the person's religious, maybe AA is a thing there. If they're not religious, maybe still AA is something that the person would be open to. Russell Brand has written lucidly about overcoming addiction through the prism of the 12-step program, but de-godifying it, if you like. You are required in the 12-step program to hand over yourself to our higher power, but that higher power doesn't necessarily have to be a Christian, Catholic God. It could be another higher power. So there's that in there as well. If the door's shut on AA for whatever reason, what other methods of support are there? And if there aren't, what professional help-wise, what support groups might there be for the problem that this person is encountering? So that ticks a certain box when it comes to professional help. If you're following along, we've already begun to ask the questions that are more orientated towards the emotions and the thoughts that are fueling these habitual behaviors. Beyond that, we're thinking about being non-judgmental with whatever we get back. We're not going to try and refocus the conversation in the place that we want it to go, which is stop drinking. Obviously, that will be the end goal, but there's maybe underlying reasons that are driving that. Secondly, we're going to gather information about what support is available, professional help. And then lastly, what I want to talk about is the self-help. Like, what can you do together or individually that is self-help orientated towards improving health? So maybe it's, what dietary adjustments can you do together? Can you have, a dry month where there's no alcohol consumed as a challenge between yourselves? Is there some way of perhaps gamifying healthy behaviors? There's been a lot of research about this lately, and a lot of apps use this principle to gamify improving your health.
Yeah.
So what sort of self-help can be done with regard to your question, SG, so that you can both adopt more healthy behaviors? And you are not coming from a point of view of preaching when you do this. What you're coming at is a point of view of collaboration. So that's really where I wanted to sort of take the conversation. Tom, do you think there's any, do we need to sort of extrapolate or open up further any of the elements of that particular equation that I was talking about?
I guess one thing I would add is just be prepared to ask twice and have the conversation. Have the conversation several times, because I think you need to expect a certain amount of pushback and maybe, what's the word? Resistance. You need to persevere with things like that to really, and part of that as well is making sure that you can keep control of your own emotions during those conversations, and like Chris said, carry on being non-judgmental throughout. But you're going to have to be prepared to have probably a few conversations before you actually, I think, break through. I don't know what Chris thinks of that, but I would imagine that it's not going to be just one conversation and then there's an epiphany where they confess.
Yeah. So what I will say about that is most definitely it may take some time, and you are not responsible for this person's behaviors. Like I said, you're responsible for love, trust, and engagement. You cannot fix this. And as men, we often try to engage with problems with an engineer's hat on. How can I fix this problem? But what does that do? That devolves the individual from having any sort of control over their circumstances. And control is a really important element for a lot of people of how they engage with mental health support. Mental Health First Aid England have been doing some really good stuff with training barbers around having supportive conversations like what I'm describing here. Because men go and get their haircut, and that's where they tend to open up. That's what their research indicated. So being ready to have these conversations in the place when, and in the space and time when a person is ready to do it, is going to be one of the things. But what I don't want you to feel, SG, is that you're walking away from this conversation that Tom and I are having about your question with the sense that you are somehow responsible for your partner. You are to some degree, but like I said, it's more about, trust, respect, love. These are what you owe them. You do not owe them the solution to their problem. You owe them bringing the problem to light, but it sounds like you've already done that, but leading them to a path or a source of support.
That's a really good point. There's only so much you can do. I would just chip in and say that. You have to, don't beat yourself up about it. If you've tried everything you can, every single avenue, you've put your heart and soul into it, and they're still not listening. I don't know what Chris would say on that, but I think there's only so far that you as an individual, as a caring family member, can go to support them before you need, again, outside intervention.
Yeah. As human beings, we have free will. We have self-agency to decide whether we want to get help or not. And so when we're talking about it, what I would like to do is just try and infuse you with the perspective that is that you're going to have a conversation that's more orientated towards avenues of support. But in order to get there, you might have to do an awful lot of non-judgmental listening and get out of your own way an awful lot in order to make that sort of connection on that level. I mean, you're partners. So clearly, you've connected on some levels, but there seems to be a schism here between the conversation around how this person is feeling and how much you want to help them. The only last thing I would say within the realm of the self-help stuff would be, encourage your partner to talk to their friends and have more connections. And one of the drivers of the problems that you've observed has been stuff with the career, but also the pandemic, the lockdown. So maybe there's a need, more of a need for social connection there that can be fostered now with meeting outside, etc., but also like using technology like video conferencing, Zoom, stuff like that to reconnect with your friends. There is some additional resources I will signpost you to. I'm not going to be too prescriptive when it comes to this, but places like the Mind charity have got some good guides. There's really good self-help leaflets out there with regard to sensible use of alcohol as well. You can search for those. But I think a little information gathering will do no harm at all, and just understand what sources of support are available. Because we live in the UK and we've got this thing called the postcode lottery. So what's available down my road will be different to what's available down your road. So, wherever you happen to live, doing a Google search along the lines of alcohol support town, wherever you are, alcohol, AA meetings town, I hope you'll have a GP and know how to contact them, so that conversation can be hosted in a much more professional way. This is about getting sources of professional help. My answer to this question is really about how to facilitate that. There's been some career issues as well. So the last thing I'll say about professional help is, what can the workplace do for them? There's a thing that a lot of organizations sign up for called an employee advisory program, or EAP. Some of the headline names include LifeWorks, AXA, Bupa Wellbeing, and Confidential Care, or CIC is their trade name. So there's a lot of businesses that have signed up, and if your partner's business is big enough, they may have access to a supportive network through work as well, where they can access counseling or, more information. Maybe they're not ready for counseling yet, I don't know. But EAP services that the employer signed up for might be worth looking at. And if you're in employment, have a look as well, because some of the businesses extend to dependents and people that they cohabit with. But I feel like I've said a lot, Tom. What would you like to add, if anything?
I think it's all great.
Okay.
In clinic is mainly Orbit, so don't worry. Yeah. But I guess one thing I would just, and this is probably to finish with, really, unless Chris wants to counter comment. I noticed that you said that it's a result of the pandemic, career, and other factors. Now, a lot of the research that I think is coming out about the pandemic is that, depression, anxiety, and all of these sorts of things are coming out and quite prevalent. So I would say that it's normal, that it's probably more normal than you think that your significant other is feeling like this. So don't think that she's alone, and that, or well, it doesn't actually say, but don't think that your partner is alone, right? There's loads of other people going through this right now. It's a tough time for everyone. So obviously, I would also say that I think the pandemic, and I'm not being judgmental, but I think the pandemic brings certain issues to light that maybe have been there for a while already. So you may want to explore that. I think a lot of people are saying, oh, it's the pandemic. It's the pandemic that has caused me to feel like this, when actually it could have just been the catalyst for whatever they were feeling before to come to light. So although they're saying the pandemic, don't think it's the pandemic. It could be something that the pandemic has just made them talk about, or really brought to light in their mind.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic's eliminated a lot of the other things that might have been coping mechanisms for whatever's going on, and has just simply magnified. Or, the pandemic and being locked up in your house 24/7 has probably been a bit of a pressure cooker, and has just magnified and enhanced a lot of the perhaps behavioral stuff that was just going on in the background. I would like to say perhaps one last thing with regard to moving beyond I'm fine. All right. Now, this is something that comes out often. How do we move past when someone just won't engage? Well, as I've said, people have the sort of will to decide for themselves not to engage in a conversation about it. But one trick that I've really found that does help an awful lot is vulnerability tends to sort of open doors. Yeah. So showing a little bit of honest, and it's got to come from a place of, authenticity. As always, I think I always like to approach these things in an authentic way. So we're not going to think up a fabricated sort of circumstance where we're now feeling that we're on edge for some reason. But if you are experiencing some challenges yourself, it can help pave the way for that conversation to take place. So, if you want to have a conversation with your partner and just say, I've been struggling a little bit, can we talk about how I'm feeling? That might be a way through to having a conversation with them about how they're feeling. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I do that myself a lot. It's just relating to the other person, what the other person is feeling, coming across more relatable. You need to, just think about how you're going into the conversation so that you can get the response that you're looking for, and showing a bit of your humanity is always good.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the question, SG. I think it was a really good one to ask, and I hope you've got some benefit of it. Very happy if you want to write us back to let us know how it's all gone. But again, I can't give medical or relationship advice, but I hope what I have done is given a perspective that might be useful for you.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what? Please do write back if it's helped, or just if you want to keep us updated on what's going on. We're very interested, and we're happy to answer more questions on it if you want to send them in, because I think that was an interesting topic.
Yeah.
So thank you, SG, for that. SG. And I think that wraps it up for this edition of the Mind Games Podcast, episode 3. I would once again like to thank my amazing co-presenter and the macaroni to my cheese, Chris Allen.
Thank you very much, Tom.
We hope you enjoy listening to these or watching if you're with us through the medium of YouTube. As much as we enjoy making them, we encourage you to like and or subscribe, share, follow on, all of our major social channels. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we are on Instagram, all Ask Mind Games. So just put in Ask Mind Games on any of those platforms, you will find us. And if you want to send in any questions, the inbox is askmindgamesuk@gmail.com. That is askmindgamesuk@gmail.com. Please put in the subject heading Mind Games question, because as the inbox fills up, we expect it to, it's going to be a lot easier to find them. And we will endeavor to answer as many as we can. Obviously, if we get a massive influx one episode, we might not be able to answer them all, but we will always try.
Yes.
And once again, thank you for listening, watching, wherever you are in the world. And we will see you on the next one.